In this video, we'll explore the excavations at Jericho. The old city of Jericho is known as Tel es Sultan. It's located in the Jordan Rift Valley, a little bit north, slightly west of the top of the Dead Sea, nestled right up against the western cliffs. It has the reputation of being the lowest elevation city on the planet, 250 meters below sea level. It's an oasis, and there is a perennial spring called Ain es Sultan. Ain is Hebrew for spring. Using Google Earth, you can see there at the center of the bottom, the northern shore of the Dead Sea. You can see the Jordan River flowing into it from the center at the top. You can then locate on the left the hills that are rising up to the Judean hills, and over those will be moving towards Jerusalem to the west. But right at the base of the hills, in that greenish area, you see the ancient city of Jericho, Tel es Sultan. Closing in on it, you can see it's a north-south, kind of an oval site. There's a modern road on the right, north-south road. And we understand from the excavators that this has deteriorated and eaten into some of the city. So it's made it a little bit difficult to excavate in that area. That road has been there a long time. As to dimension, it spreads over about 1 acre and rises to a height of about 21.5 meters. As to the record of excavations, we find that early on in the late 1860s, Charles Warren, with the Palestine Exploration Fund, undertook several soundings, but concluded there was really no occupation here. About 40 years later, an Austro-German expedition, led by Sellen and Watzinger, undertook to clear the face of much of the early bronze town wall, so they were able to identify quite an extent of that. And as to middle bronze, they traced about half of the support structure at the base of those defenses, the revetment. In addition, at the north end of the tell, they cleared quite a span of houses. Moving on, in the 1930s, John Garstang undertook some significant excavations over about a 7-year span. It's worth observing that he was moving with a particular agenda. His goal was to show the reliability of the biblical presentation of Joshua's campaign. Regardless our commitment to the fidelity and trustworthiness of Scripture, I trust you can sense that this is not the best approach. Rather, we should look at the evidence as it stands. He came away with a better understanding of the pottery chronology of the site. But by now you should appreciate that by not retaining a careful record of the layers of habitation, a detailed stratigraphy, then his results were compromised to some degree. They were current in his era, but subsequently we've learned the importance of retaining a record of detailed stratigraphy. He looked at some of the defenses, some of the walls, and as people have revisited his classification of them, they've discovered that he assigned them to the wrong era. That can happen. His excavation went so far as to discover the Neolithic era. They are buried below the Bronze Age era. And often you'll find reference to an era known as the pre-pottery Neolithic. Just as it sounds, it's a culture that's using stone tools. They had not developed the capacity to work with metals yet, nor had they developed the capacity to work with clay for ceramic objects, so pre-pottery Neolithic. Some 15 to 20 years later, Dame Kathleen Kenyon from Britain comes and undertakes a very substantial, momentous series of excavations, very influential for understanding this site. They were not the last, but they were certainly a turning point. She was operating under the auspices of the British School of Archaeology there in Jerusalem. And wasn't this founded by Flinders Petrie? I believe it was. In addition to looking at some walls, she's famous for having uncovered a very substantial burial area called a necropolis. It's located a bit northwest of the Tell, and there were in excess of 600 tombs that she examined. If you haven't figured it out by now, it may be helpful to observe that tombs can be very valuable because they tend to protect the contents, whereas a typical habitation area, a community, may be leveled, destroyed by invaders, and then rendered suitable for rehabilitation. And in that process, household implements, pottery, and structures are just destroyed. In contrast, tombs can be preserved. People don't typically build onto a tomb. They rather protect it. Certainly it can suffer collapse. It can suffer robbery, but often this can be an excellent place from which to retrieve artifacts such as tools or dishes or, as you'll see in Jericho, very uncommonly, furniture, wooden furniture that reflect a given layer of a culture, given era of a culture. So those tombs ranged, as you see, from early bronze all the way into the Roman period. As far as trenches on the Tell itself, when we look at a map, in the next slide you'll see that there was a trench that she dug in the northern flank, and her team then dug another in the western flank, and a third in the southern flank. Let's study those. Here we have two sketches, both reflecting the Kenyan excavations principally. The sketch on the left comes from Kenyon's book, Archaeology in the Holy Land. It's helpful because it details some of the regions, the rectangles that are off-center, that are not just part of the grid pattern. So, for example, in the green highlighted area in the upper right, you see first the wording trench, Roman numeral 2, and then you see E1, E2, E3. Those are excavation regions, slightly distinct from Trench 2. Trench 2 refers to the north-south rectangle that's highlighted in yellow in this the diagram on the left. Incidentally, we've used the same color code, so if you look at the diagram, the sketch on the right, top center, the yellow highlighted area, once again, that's Trench 2. Footnote, if you're checking the caption, the trench numbers have not been consistently labeled. In other words, I'm more inclined to trust the earlier work on the left as far as the trench numbers. So the north central one is Trench 2. If you look at the diagram on the right, the yellow shaded area top center is accompanied by the numeral 4. Follow that code down to the bottom and you'll see that it's labeled there as not Kenyon's Trench 2, but Trench 1. I don't believe that's correct. I think we should follow the code that's in the earlier work on the left. So again, diagram on the left gives us a little more detail as far as excavation zones. It overlaps with the diagram on the right as far as giving us these three trenches. One, if we're thinking of it like an analogical clock, it's at the 12 o'clock zone. Another trench would be at the 9 o'clock zone running east-west. You see it highlighted in light blue, and in the left diagram you can identify that as Trench 1. And then at the 6 o'clock position in kind of a rose or pink color is Trench 3. So here we have our main trenches. Then, as indicated earlier, the various oblong or square rectangles that have a letter plus a numeral, like A2 or F1 or H4, Roman numerals. Those are also excavation regions. The last thing for orientation we want to observe here are the shaded, sort of semicircular, it looks like a large C, the letter C, doesn't it? You have three concentric, they're not really concentric rings because they're not complete, but they're following the contour of the top of the mound. So one of those, the trench at the top of the page, the upper portion of the trench in yellow just crosses into the outermost ring, and that's a wall, and then the middle wall, and then it also cuts into the innermost wall. Now what's helpful about the diagram on the right is we learn which walls those are. They're numbered. So for example, on the diagram on the right, numeral 2, bring that down and you can see that's labeled the retaining wall of the glacis from the Middle Bronze Age 2. In contrast to that, numeral 3 is the glacis, and numeral 1 is the city wall from early Bronze Age. You may wish to return to this portion of the video to consult the scheme at another time. While we're looking at this, it might be helpful to comment that the reason the tracking or the tracing of the walls does not make a full, complete enclosure, the eastern portion, these maps are oriented with north to the top. So they're open on the east, not because this was the original design of the city walls, but because there's been very significant erosion on that side. The hill itself slopes down to the east towards the spring. You don't see labeled a spring, but in the diagram on the left you see a reservoir, and in the diagram on the right you see the numeral 8, which explains in the caption, pools near the spring. So the Ain es-Sultan, the spring es-Sultan, was a perennial spring, a very rich source of flowing water, so fundamental to any place of human habitation. The excavations by Kenyon were by no means the last. Others have followed, including Department of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage and the Antiquities of Palestinian National Authority, working with La Sapienza University of Rome. And they worked in the area of Bronze Age fortifications and some residential quarters. We've looked then at some of the excavations, and there are some that I have not covered as well. So this is not an exhaustive list. But let's move now to let this hill and the excavations that have explored it begin to tell us the story. What was life like? What has this territory seen in terms of human occupation? The dates that I'm using are the commonly accepted dates, so I'll just report to you what the professionals in the field regard as the best estimate. So there's evidence of what's known as a Natufian culture in what's known as the Mesolithic era. And you can see the rough time period there. As far as a representation of that very early culture, Jericho operates as a very prominent site across the Near East. So this is no insignificant site. And then we move to Proto-Neolithic. Again, notice the years that are listed here. I should also comment that next to the years, you see Sultan level 0 for Mesolithic. That means that's the base level. Below that, you'd be working on bedrock or whatever was the native surface. Proto-Neolithic, then Sultan level 1A, so moving up from bedrock to the first portion of a level. Then here comes pre-pottery Neolithic. We introduced that term a little bit earlier. And at Jericho, it's divided into pre-pottery Neolithic A and pre-pottery Neolithic B. It's, for convenience sake, common to abbreviate this PPN-A or PPN-B, pre-pottery Neolithic, either A or B. And you can see the dates for this, and also the level at this site, Tel es Sultan, levels 1B and 1C relate to Neolithic ppN A and B. Population for the earlier of these two, they estimate about 2,000 people. What sort of a culture was it? Agricultural. And they go so far as to say they may have been sufficiently organized to have developed irrigation. Here's the situation. You've got an excellent spring. Left on its own, though, it won't supply a very large territory. It's just a spring, perhaps a pool, and some runoff, probably making its way down to the Dead Sea. But it offers sufficient volume of water that if you have a stable community and can dig some canals, there's enough water to irrigate a larger farm area. That means we've probably got a farming community with some level of political stability. The same concept, incidentally, holds true for cultures where terracing is important. Think of rice cultures in Asia, and Asia is not the only place that terraces for rice. But if you've studied this at all, you're aware that evidence of terracing means that there must be a significant amount of political stability. Otherwise, the effort required to establish those terraced areas for the rice paddies would be futilely invested if they're going to be overrun by enemies and so forth. So, organized irrigation from a spring. What kind of buildings do we find here? Well, we find buildings, foundations extant that consist of bricks, modular bricks. In contrast to what? Well, in contrast to stone. Further up in the hill country, you've got limestone or fieldstone that are gathered or quarried and sometimes machined, in a sense, been shaped, cut and shaped, but not here. There's not as much availability of stone, so they did what was done in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. They did what was done in the Nile area, principally relying on mud bricks. Certainly there was quarrying of stone in Egypt as well, but a lot of structures were built of mud bricks. As we look at the houses, what was the shape of them? Well, we find that they are circular and they seem to be single room. Later on, we'll be able to distinguish a subsequent culture as they move away from circular houses, one room, into rectangular houses, multiple room. As you might expect for a pre-pottery culture, a lot of evidence of flint for tools, fashioned flint and also bone. You can read the remainder of bullets and just appreciate some of the discoveries that they have found at the pre-pottery Neolithic A. We find ppN-A came to an abrupt end, and it was followed by a lot of deterioration from erosion, so just natural rainfall and deterioration of the surface of the soil, and then comes ppN-B.